This is the story of John Clark, the founder of the First Baptist Church in the United States of America. All right, let's get into it. God in His providence has allowed many great men and women to be used as framers, founders, and even fighters for truth and right. Few men excel more than one of these fields. Few more men excel in more than one of these fields. I'm going to calm down and get this right here. A handful of men have understood the immense importance of both religious and political liberty and their relationship to one another. An even more obscure company of good men have championed religious and political liberty while exercising their spiritual gifts and showing men that liberty of soul that only comes through a born-again experience with Jesus Christ. A mostly unknown New England Baptist minister of the 17th century was one such man. If ever a list could be compiled that contained the names of the most important men in America, or America's history, as well as world history, this man's name would most surely appear near the very top. This man's name is Dr. John Clark. For those who think that the previous statements are more like overstatements, consider just a few of the many accomplishments of John Clark. Dr. Clark started the First Baptist Church on American soil, which he pastored for 38 years. He held the first recorded evangelistic revival meeting in the New World. He was honored after his death for his medical contributions by the Newport Medical Society. He was the author of the Portsmouth Compact, and he was a procurer of the famous Colonial Charter of 1663. In addition to all of these accomplishments, he was a deputy governor for 2 terms, a deputy in the assembly for some years, and was a chief commissioner in adjusting the boundaries of the land. This is not enough. He was elected to codify the law and later to compose and organize the statutes of his colony. This is not all he did, but let it suffice to prove the greatest skeptic that John Clark is most... This is not all he did, but let it suffice to prove to the greatest skeptic that Dr. John Clark is most worthy of great attention in a volume such as this. Many in the unsaved world marvel at his life of accomplishments. How much more should Baptists be acquainted with and appreciate of all that he was and did. This study will show to the reader how important his life was and contribution to liberty and Christianity truly were. In the course of human history, twists and turns that changed entire landscapes of the world are clearly evident. The founding of the nation of Israel and of the somewhat recent rebirth of Israel, the rise and fall of Rome, the climb of the subsequent crash and burn of Nazi Germany are just a few of those hinge-type events. In the last millennium, however, arguably the greatest human event concerning the nations has been the creation of America and the land of liberty. America, with all of her flaws, has yielded enormous influence throughout the whole world. Much of its influence has been positive. The distribution of millions of Bibles, tracts, and tons of food and republic ideals are just a few of the ways the existence of America has shaped history of the world. When God set out to unfold His plan for America, He chose to raise up key men who He could use to unfold the plan and paint a new landscape. John Clark was such a man. He was absolutely raised up for such a time as this. The author often refers to him as the pivotal John Clark. And why call him this? Everything he did was either revolutionary, unheard of, or simply thought to be impossible. And yet the task he accomplished to Clark seemed to be only his reasonable service. He ministered in an era where the first building blocks were laid politically, spiritually, and physically. It is not an exaggeration to say that he was a church builder, a colony builder, and a key early framer of our sound form of government itself. In the next section, we will examine these 3 areas under the heading of the Pioneer Clark. So let's look at that. So his birth, John Clark was born on October 3rd, 1609. And in the small farming community of Westhorpe, England, he was reared in a family of 8 children. 5 of his siblings followed him to the New World, where 4 of them settled at Newport. His education and expertise, he attended his local village school and would later attend the University of Leiden in Holland. One can only assume, having no clear record, that he, even in his formative years, Clark was a scholar by every definition. By the time he had landed in America, he was not just acquainted with several fields of learning, but literally mastered them all. He was a master in theology. He caused and learned the heathen of his day to stutter and second-guess themselves when he opened his mouth in defense of the Baptist faith. There were more than a few religious leaders and state officials who regretted undertaking the public debate with him. His skills in medicine were equally incredible, as true believers should understand why. It should be a common conviction among believers that those who know the great physician are most qualified to take upon themselves the task of healing the sick. As has already been stated, he was honored after his death for his medical contributions by the Newport Medical Society. Not only did he excel in these areas, but he had a firm grasp on the principles of law. Clark was not just the average lawyer. He focused his knowledge on the law towards one area he was most well known for in the world: his expertise as a statesman and framer of the civil government. When one considers just how brilliant a mind he possessed and the many difficult fields he excelled in, one is dumbfounded. In wisdom alone, history struggles to produce an equal to Brother John Clark. John Clark is a list of accomplishments that cannot be fully examined in just such a few short pages. Some of these accomplishments have been listed in the introductory paragraph, and now we'll focus on these two areas that he made the greatest impact. Number one, church builder. We realize that the Bible clearly teaches that Jesus Christ has promised to build his church in Matthew 16:18. And God deserves all the glory for promising and performing this task. And yet, when it comes to building such much needed facilities for his church to meet in, he delegates such labors to faithful men. The actual gathering, organizing, teaching, preaching duties are also committed to God's men. Faithful men work for God and with God and are blessed by God to accomplish great things. Clark was a tool that God used to transplant Baptist principles and practices, as well as scriptural authority, into the New World. He would not be the only one to come and spread his Baptist faith. Many would follow. He was, however, the first to do so. Amazingly, the labors he performed produced a congregation that has perpetually met in Newport for nearly 400 years. This is a testimony not only of Clark's willingness to serve, but also of God's willingness to use sinful men. John Clark landed in the New World in 1637. There in Boston, he, along with his wife Elizabeth, began to minister to the needs of the people. Initially, his skill as a doctor was of utmost importance, as doctors were scarce and sickness was common in those days. It wasn't long before Clark became a lightning rod of disruption and protest. Clark very quickly became aware of the sad facts concerning the churches of New England. Roger Williams had been banished before Clark ever arrived. Remember that name. Subsequently, the magistrates' law was passed. This law made it illegal to be affiliated with non-approved churches. During this time, there was a debate in the air. The antinomian debates involved the truths of law and grace. These debates began as a discussion as to what evidence is accepted as proof of salvation. You'll hear me talk about this all the time. This is me talking now about this very thing. So listen carefully. They evolved into full-blown bones of contention and ultimately harsh division. The antinomians were preachers of grace and were within the bounds of sound theology in this particular debate. Even the most scriptural of the colonial preachers were quickly banished or persuaded to embrace the errors of the establishment churches. During this time, a woman named Anna Hutchinson, an antinomian, was excommunicated from the state church. In March of 1638, the Reverend John Wilson, standing in his crow's nest pulpit, publicly stated these words: "Therefore, in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and in the name of the church, I do not only pronounce you worthy to be cast out, but I do cast you out, and in the name of Christ do I deliver you up to Satan, that you may learn to no more to blaspheme, to seduce, and to lie. And I do account you from this time forth to be a heathen and a publican, and so to be held of all the brethren and sisters in this congregation and of others. Therefore I command you in the name of Jesus Christ and the church and of the church as a leper to withdraw yourself from this congregation." Now, this lady was kicked out, and there were many others that were kicked out of the New England established basically a government church. It was the government church of the day, and they were disenfranchised. They were kicked out of the community because if you weren't in good with the church, you were not in good with the government. You couldn't vote. You couldn't participate in the society. I'm adding my thoughts here because I wanted to just explain this part. It was kind of a little bit unclear to understand. But Clark himself was without a gun, as his weapons had been confiscated for suspicion of Anabaptist. So, and being an Anabaptist. Now, let me just take a pause here for just a moment to explain this piece of history. I was just telling Brother Greg about it. Did you look up that article? I think it's the Antinomian debate or the Antinomian debates on Wikipedia. Does that sound right? Or the Antinomian controversy. So look that up sometime. The word antinomian means anti-law. Now, technically, I think this might have been sort of like a negative term put on people. But basically, if you were to look that up, there was the Calvinists who were saying one of two things. And by the way, this is not what we agree with, okay? They say that you have to either work to get saved or have to prove that you are saved by showing some measure of works. And they will look at you and judge you. And the antinomians, or the anti-law, were the ones that were saying, no, you don't have to prove your works by your salvation by your works, and you don't have to. There's no works involved at all. And so that's when John Clark got kicked out with all the other Baptistic type of people. They were kicked out of that region. And now that picks up the story. So it was the people who believed in a clear gospel, and it was being kicked out by a bunch of stinking Calvinists up in New England. All right, that were trying to push this works-based salvation on people. So beware of that. We have a long history of that. So I wanted to just point that out. Now let me keep reading. I got just a few more minutes of this. Both the need to relocate and to organize a scriptural church were pressing on the heart of Brother Clark. And so being the leader that he was, he tackled both issues at the same time. He would prove to be the founder not only of a place to exist, but founder and leader of a scriptural New Testament congregation ordered after the laws of God's holy word. The First Baptist congregation in America existed in its infant form by the winter of 1637. Clark's family and 18 other families traveled to New Hampshire at this time in search of religious liberty. The group that had left Boston, being so zealously involved in their form of religious teachings, surely must have organized preaching services consistently, even though they were on the move. We admittedly have no concrete evidence of that he organized a church and administered scriptural ordinances during this time. However, knowing the enterprising spirit and strong Baptist convictions, his desire to be biblical, and his future faithful service, we assume this traveling congregation was ordered and properly, and it is the belief of many that Clark was baptized and possibly ordained in Elder Stilwell's church in London, England. This group would not find rest in New Hampshire and were forced to move. The move from Boston was to flee the hot debates, where the move from New Hampshire was to flee the cold winter. And in 1638, they traveled on southward into the Narragansett Bay. Here, freedom fighter Roger Williams coaxed them to move onto the island of Aquidneck. I don't even know how to say that word. And then this they did. And before long, they landed on the island that would eventually be called Rhode Island. The year was 1638, and they purchased this piece of land from the Indians and settled on its northern section. This is where the famous Portsmouth Compact, authored by Clark, was signed. The traveling group landed and immediately compacted together to form a government with full liberty and conscience for all. Full liberty of conscience for all. This truly was a landmark event. Still, in 1638, a portion of this original group, including Clark, migrated to a little piece of ground on the south end of the island. They named the place Newport. Not only was Newport founded at this time, but it became a permanent home for the First Baptist Church. This congregation, started and pastored by the first Clark, still exists today in Newport. Now, the legal, political, and diplomatic work that John Clark engaged in would eventually aid in the establishment of a colony. This colony, in time, would become the state of Rhode Island. From the very first days of Clark's arrival in Boston, his incredible influence in political happenings was felt throughout the New World. He, for many years, held ideas that few others did. He knew how to articulate these great principles, and the effects were far-reaching. His political involvements must not be understood as some sort of strong-arm manipulation. Rather, he was ever the diplomat and gentleman. His whole reason for leaving Boston was so he could establish a church and country where he and others could peaceably worship the Lord. Unlike the Anglicans, he never had a desire to attempt to rule the hearts and minds of men. The Baptist pastor, Dr. Wilbur Nelson, said the following about Clark's work as a statesman. From the beginning of the movement that resulted in the founding of Portsmouth and Newport until the charter of 1663 was obtained, he was active in public affairs. He held few public offices but served on many important committees, and in a wise and constructive way was the advisor and leading spirit in the organization and administration of town and colony government. So, the political labors of Clark were done with virtually selfless motives, as we will see. The results of his work and blessing and his sacrifice would be enjoyed much more by future generations than even his own generation. To the casual observer, the Portsmouth, Rhode Island, appears to be a common everyday northeastern town. The truth is that here is where America had its first taste of true, unbridled liberty. The traveling group landed here, and Clark drew up a governmental compact to live by. The compact reads as follows: the Portsmouth Compact. We whose names are underwritten do hereby solemnly in the presence of Jehovah incorporate ourselves into a body politic, as he shall help. Will submit our persons, lives, and estates unto the Lord Jesus Christ, the King of kings and Lord of lords, and to all those perfect and absolute laws of his given in his holy word of truth, to be guided and judged thereby. The compact was then signed by 23 of the leading men in the group. Becoming New England is, I think I just, I skipped a page there. The bronze tablet attached to the large stone was unveiled in 1936 in memory of the unique accomplishments of John Clark, and it reads, and it has a picture in here, erected to honor the memory and perpetuate the spirit and ideals of the founders of the first government in the world, to allow and ensure its citizens had civil and religious liberty. Established on this site in 1638. You can still go up there and visit that in Rhode Island today. As great as this was, it was only a first step in Clark's establishing a larger group of people on an even larger piece of land under the same governing principles of liberty, of conscience. The colonial charter in Rhode Island's State House in Providence, framed in an expensive fireproof safe, is housed one of the most uniquely important documents ever produced in the history of the world. This document granted a full liberty in religious concernments to the people of Rhode Island. The Rhode Island Charter, sometimes referred to as the Colonial Charter of 1663, was authored and won virtually single-handedly by none other than Dr. John Clark. This ancient document, beautifully penned on fine parchment, should be studied and modeled and appreciated by individuals and governments throughout the world. Carved into the marble above the south entrance of the Providence State House are the following words taken from the charter itself: to hold forth the lively experiment that a most flourishing civil state may stand and be blessed, be maintained with full liberty in religious concernments. The previous principles are what Clark called a lively experiment. These words, lively experiment, have been often quoted in description of this experimental form of government framed by Clark. The procuring of this document was not a task for the unconcerned or commonplace citizen. Once again, as the divine hand of grace moved, this hand directed John Clark to sacrifice a large part of his life to win the right for the gospel to be freely preached among the people of the colonies. By the time 1663 rolled around, Clark had spent a total of 13 years as an ambassador sent from Rhode Island. His sole purpose was to persuade the crown, through much diplomacy and scholarly evidence, that there was a great need for liberty of conscience in the New World. In 1652, Clark wrote his famous book entitled "Ill News from New England." In this book, he proclaimed the mistreatment of Baptist brethren in the New World. One popular statement in this book reads, "While Old England is becoming new, New England is becoming old." This burden he carried and the burden he pleaded until Charles II granted him the charter in 1663. This charter was the ruling document in Rhode Island until the colony became a state, and then it became the state's constitution for another 67 years. This present-day state constitution was adopted in 1843 and holds much of the same principles the original charter did. The original colonial charter was then retired. For 180 years, these principles governed in the state of Rhode Island and Providence plantations. Thomas Jefferson is said to have given Dr. John Clark the credit for obtaining this remarkable charter and to have named it as one of the sources from which he derived the principles of the Declaration of Independence. The unsung hero. The sad reality is that many people have never heard of John Clark or his great principles. His sacrificial life is a narrative that begs to be heralded to the next generation as well as to the present one. He is one of the history's most unsung heroes. Wilbur Nelson, writing in the preface of The Hero of Aquidneck, said this of Clark: "The magnitude of his life and labors have never been fully appreciated." Nelson went on to say Dr. John Clark of Newport was one of the most eminent men of the 17th century. No name in the annals of American history is more important than his, no character deserving of more lasting honor. As a Christian gentleman, pure-minded, unselfish, modest, and sincere, he represents the noblest type of American manhood. As a scholar, physician, and Christian minister, he takes the highest rank. As a statesman laboring to establish a commonwealth on the principles of full liberty in religious concernments, he has been properly called the foremost American diplomat of his age. Loved in sorry, that was the end of the quote there. All right, and then I'm almost done. C.E. Barrows said this of Dr. John Clark: "From its inception, Mr. Clark was a leading spirit in the new colony. His life was so interwoven with its history that to have a correct knowledge of this one necessitates knowledge of the other. He was almost always employed for the public good. His disciplined mind brought constant and invaluable aid to the infant colony. To no one, perhaps, was the colony under greater obligation than to him. Yet, so quietly and unobtrusively did he do his work that his great merits have not been duly appreciated. But the careful student of this early period discovers him in the colony's guiding genius. The better his history is known, the more commanding is the position assigned him." We find that his own contemporaries thought fondly of him. The great freedom fighter Roger Williams wrote the following concerning Clark in the flyleaf of one of his books: "For his honored and beloved Mr. John Clark, an eminent witness of Jesus Christ against the bloody doctrine of persecution." This was written as in the foreword, the flyleaf of The Bloody Tenet, Yet More Bloody. I'll have to tell that story sometime. A few of you know that. Again, C.E. Barrows is quoted as saying he deserves to be enrolled among the benefactors of the world. That is the story of John Clark. I hope you enjoyed that.